The tide was low the morning I finally stopped flinching every time someone knocked on the cottage door. I was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the Pacific fog burn off the headland the way it did most mornings in Cannon Beach, when I heard the twins stirring in the nursery down the hall. Woke first, always did. A small indignant cry that meant she wanted to be picked up immediately, and William would follow 30 seconds later, never wanting to be left out of anything, even his own protests. I set the mug down and rolled my sleeve back before I went to get them, an old habit now, checking the faint silver line of scar tissue on the inside of my forearm the way some people check a watch. It didn't hurt anymore. It hadn't hurt in months, but I still looked at it every morning the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to be. My name is Maya, and until the night my father grabbed that arm hard enough to tear an IV line out of it, I believed my family's love was simply quieter than other people's, not absent. I was 29 years old, a pediatric ICU nurse living in Portland, Oregon, and for most of my adult life I told myself that the distance I felt from them was something I was imagining, something I could close if I just tried harder, gave more, asked for less. I don't believe that anymore. But to understand exactly how far that quiet distance stretched before it finally tore open, you have to go back to the year my grandmother died. I grew up the older of two daughters in a family that, from the outside, looked like a success story built entirely on hard work. My father had taken over a single roadside motel from his own father in the 80s and spent 3 decades turning it into the Collection, a small but respected chain of boutique hotels scattered across the Pacific Northwest coast, the kind of properties travel magazines like to photograph at golden hour. All reclaimed wood and ocean views and fireplaces that never quite went out. My mother, Carol, ran the design and branding side of the business with the same controlled precision she brought to everything, including, I would eventually understand, her own family. There was never a formal announcement of who mattered more between my sister and me. It happened the way most things happened in our house, quietly, through 1,000 small decisions that only made sense once you stepped back far enough to see the pattern. Was 2 years younger, and from the time she was small, she wanted exactly what our parents wanted for her, which made loving her easy for them in a way that loving me apparently was not. She majored in hospitality management. She interned at 3 different properties before she'd even graduated. By 24, she had an office 2 doors down from our father's, a title with the word director in it, and an easy, practiced warmth with hotel guests that made my mother's chest visibly swell with pride at every family dinner. I remember one birthday clearly enough that it has never quite faded, the way certain small moments end up carrying more weight than they should. I was 11. My father had promised, weeks in advance, that he would take the whole afternoon off to help me build the volcano I needed for a school science project, the kind of promise that felt enormous to an 11-year-old. A whole uninterrupted afternoon of him. He canceled that morning because then 9 had a dance recital rehearsal that ran long, and someone needed to drive her. My mother built the volcano with me instead, distracted, checking her watch every few minutes. And when my father finally came home that evening, he spent 20 minutes praising rehearsal before he ever asked how my project had turned out. I didn't understand at 11 that I was watching a pattern begin. I only understood much later that I had spent the rest of my childhood quietly trying to become interesting enough, accomplished enough, useful enough to be looked at the way he looked at her without having to ask for it. I wanted to be a nurse. I had wanted it since I was 12 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room while my grandmother had her hip replaced, watching the nurses move through that chaos with a calm competence that looked to me like the most useful kind of magic in the world. When I told my parents at 17 that I had no interest in the family business, my father didn't argue with me exactly. He simply looked disappointed in the specific, controlled way that was somehow worse than shouting and said, "Well, I suppose someone has to do the practical work in this world," in a tone that made it clear he didn't consider what I'd chosen to be practical in any sense that mattered to him. I met Daniel the summer after nursing school, at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I fell for him with an ease that should have told me something important about how right it was. He was a firefighter, the kind of work that meant long stretches away every fire season and a quiet, unglamorous steadiness the rest of the year. And he had exactly none of the polish my parents valued in the men brought home. My mother met him twice before our wedding and asked me on both occasions some version of the same question. "Are you sure this is what you want for your life, Maya? It seems like a lot of uncertainty. I married him anyway in a small ceremony at a state park an hour outside Portland, and my parents attended, technically, standing near the back the entire reception like guests at a party they hadn't chosen to be invited to. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the only person in that side of the family who never made me feel like I'd disappointed some invisible ledger. She'd bought a small cottage on the Cannon Beach headland in the 70s, back when the whole stretch of coastline was still sleepy and undervalued, and she'd lived there alone for the last 15 years of her life, fiercely independent, walking the beach every morning regardless of weather. I visited her every single week, even after I was married, even after 12-hour hospital shifts left me exhausted enough that the 2-hour drive felt like a genuine sacrifice. Visited when it was convenient, which by my count worked out to perhaps 4 times a year. You're the only one who comes because you want to, not because you feel obligated, my grandmother told me once, sitting on her porch with a blanket over her knees watching the surf. People forget kindness the moment it's inconvenient to remember it, Maya. But paperwork they never forget. Whatever you do in this life, keep records, not because you don't trust people, because eventually somebody's memory will get very convenient and you'll need something better than your word against theirs. I didn't understand at the time how directly she was preparing me for something. She died 3 years ago in early spring of a stroke that took her quickly and I hoped without much suffering. At the reading of her will, my mother sat very still while the attorney explained that the cottage, the land, the structure, the modest trust that covered its taxes and upkeep had been left to me outright. Received a set of my grandmother's jewelry and a small cash sum. There was no letter, no explanation attached. My grandmother had simply made her decision the way she made every decision, quietly, without asking anyone's permission to feel a certain way about it. My mother's face when the attorney finished reading was the first time I understood, with real clarity, how much she resented me. The pressure started small enough that, for the first year, I genuinely convinced myself I was imagining it. Comments over holiday dinners about how the cottage could really use the family's touch. About how it seemed like such a shame that a property with that kind of ocean frontage was just sitting there being used by one person, as though Daniel and I renting it out on weekends we weren't using it, quietly and modestly, through a small local property manager, wasn't already generating income that covered its own upkeep twice over. Then, 18 months ago, got engaged to whose family owned a chain of upscale restaurants along the coast, and the pressure sharpened into something with an actual shape. Wouldn't it be beautiful, my mother said, at a dinner meant to celebrate the engagement, to host the rehearsal dinner at Grandma's cottage? It would mean so much to everyone. And obviously we wouldn't expect you to cover any of the costs, Maya, we just need the venue. I said yes to that one. It felt like a small enough thing, and some part of me still wanted, even then, to be the daughter who made things easy. The rehearsal dinner itself went smoothly enough on its surface. String lights across the porch. A caterer I'd vetted myself, my mother photographing every corner of the cottage with an appraising eye I chose not to examine too closely at the time. It was near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had drifted down toward the water, that my mother found me refilling a drink tray in the kitchen and said almost, "You know, a property like this really should be earning its keep for the whole family, not just sitting here for your weekend getaways. And we're just saying how perfect it would be for their own honeymoon send-off next year. Maybe we should talk about some kind of arrangement." I told her I'd think about it, mostly to end the conversation, and I understood only in hindsight that "I'll think about it" was the exact opening she'd been waiting for. What I didn't fully register that night was how quickly the venue for one dinner became the venue for the engagement photos became, 3 months later, my father sitting across from me at a coffee shop with a folder of numbers, explaining that its actual wedding venue, a cliffside estate an hour south that's family had their hearts set on, required a deposit substantially larger than what the combined had budgeted for. "We were thinking," my father said, in the careful, controlled tone he used when he'd already decided something and was simply informing me of it, "that we could use the cottage as collateral, just temporarily. A short-term loan against the property, nothing permanent. It would solve the whole problem. It's not for sale, Dad, and it's not collateral for anything. It was Grandma's and she left it to me specifically. Nobody's asking you to sell it," he said, his jaw tightening in the way it always did when I disagreed with him in a room with more than the two of us in it. "We're asking you to help your sister the way this family has always helped each other. "Has it though?" I asked, and I watched something flicker across his face gone before I could name it. Because I don't remember anyone helping me buy our house, or covering nursing school when the loans came due early. I remember being told I'd made my choices and needed to live with them. That's a completely different situation, and you know it. How is it different? He didn't answer that directly. He slid the folder an inch closer to me instead, tapping it once with 2 fingers, a gesture I recognized from every negotiation I'd ever watched him run with a hotel vendor. The venue holds the date for 30 days with a partial deposit. We're 11 days out. I'm not asking you to give anything away, Maya. I'm asking for a signature on a short-term instrument that protects everyone, including you. Your mother thinks you're being emotional about a building. It's not a building. It's the only thing in this family that was ever just mine, given to me by someone who actually paid attention to who I was instead of who she wanted me to become. He closed the folder without another word, the particular silence he used instead of conceding a point, and left cash on the table for a coffee neither of us had finished. I didn't sign anything. I told him no plainly and drove the 2 hours home to Portland with my hands too tight on the steering wheel, and I didn't hear from either of my parents for almost 3 weeks after that, which was, in its own way, an answer. I was 6 months pregnant with twins by then, a discovery that had genuinely stunned Daniel and me, 2 heartbeats where we'd braced for one, and my obstetrician had already flagged the pregnancy as high risk given my blood pressure numbers, which meant more appointments, more monitoring, and an underlying current of worry I tried hard not to let dominate every day. Daniel took it seriously in every way a person could. He read everything. He came to every appointment his fire season schedule allowed. He installed a blood pressure cuff on our nightstand and made a small, careful ritual of checking mine every evening, the same steady attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. My parents knew all of this. My mother called occasionally to ask how I was feeling, in the detached way you'd ask a coworker, but neither she nor my father offered anything practical. No help preparing the nursery, no offer to come stay for a few days, nothing that resembled the kind of support I watched other expectant mothers describe receiving from their own families. When I mentioned to my mother during one of those calls that Daniel would be deployed on a wildfire assignment out of state during my final month, hopefully home before my due date, but with no guarantees given how unpredictable fire season could be, there was a pause on the line before she said, "Well, I'm sure you'll manage. You always do." I told myself that was a compliment for a long time. It took me longer than it should have to hear it for what it actually was. Daniel left for the fire assignment on a Tuesday in late September, 34 weeks into the pregnancy. Both of us reassured by my doctor that everything looked stable enough to proceed as long as I kept my follow-up appointments and called immediately if anything changed. He held my face in both hands at the door and made me promise, the way he always did before he left, that I would call my mother if I needed anything at all. "I will," I told him, and I meant it, not yet understanding how little that promise would end up being worth. The headache started on a Thursday evening, 4 days into Daniel's assignment. A dull pressure behind my eyes that I initially blamed on too many hours staring at hospital paperwork during a shift that had run long. By the time I got home, it had sharpened into something worse, accompanied by a strange, swimming distortion at the edges of my vision that made me stop halfway through making dinner and sit down hard on the kitchen floor, one hand pressed flat against my enormous belly, trying to breathe through a fear I recognized immediately from every prenatal class I'd taken and every ICU rotation I'd ever worked: preeclampsia. I knew the warning signs better than most people ever would, and I was watching several of them assemble themselves in real time inside my own body. I sat there on the cold tile for longer than I should have, one hand still pressed to my belly, running through the mental checklist I'd walked 100 frightened patients through myself over the years, and finding, with a kind of detached horror, that I could check off nearly every item on it. The visual distortion sharpened into something like heat shimmer at the edges of the kitchen light fixture. A dull ache had settled beneath my right ribs that I recognized, distantly, as liver involvement. The kind of detail a nurse's brain doesn't let you know even when you desperately want to be wrong. I thought about calling Daniel first and made myself not do it, not wanting to pull his focus from an active fire line over something I told myself, without much conviction, might still turn out to be nothing. I called my mother before I called anyone else, because Daniel had made me promise, And because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still believed that a genuine emergency would finally be the thing that broke through whatever wall existed between us. Mom, I think something's wrong. My blood pressure's been high all week and now I've got this headache that won't go away and my vision's doing something strange. I think I need to go to the hospital and I don't want to drive myself like this. There was a pause and in the background I could hear the specific, bright clatter of a restaurant kitchen. Oh, sweetheart, that sounds scary. Listen, I'm actually at the cake tasting with right now. We've been trying to get this appointment for weeks. Can you call in? I really can't leave in the middle of this. They only had this one slot available. Mom, I might be having a seizure risk complication. I need someone to actually be with me. You're a nurse, Maya. You know your own body better than anyone. I'm sure you're fine. You're probably just stressed. Call your father if you're really worried. He might be able to swing by after his meeting. Another pause, muffled, her voice pulling away from the phone to say something to about frosting flavors before returning. I have to go, honey. They're bringing out the next tier. Keep me posted. She hung up before I could say anything else. I called an ambulance instead of my father, because some clear, cold part of my nursing brain had already taken over from the frightened part. And I remember very little of the ride to the hospital, except the paramedic's steady voice telling me to keep breathing, and the strange, distant clarity of watching my own blood pressure cuff numbers climb on the small monitor beside me and understanding, professionally, exactly how much danger those numbers represent. By the time I reached the hospital, my blood pressure had climbed high enough that the obstetric team made the decision within the hour to deliver by emergency cesarean rather than risk waiting any longer. I remember the overhead lights, and the particular calm urgency of a surgical team that has done this exact dance 1,000 times before. And then, astonishingly, two separate small cries, thin and furious and perfect, arriving seconds apart. Both twins were healthy, small but stable, moved to the NICU as a precaution given their early arrival at 34 weeks. I was moved to the ICU myself for the standard 48 hours of magnesium sulfate treatment, the medication that prevents the seizures that severe preeclampsia can trigger even after delivery. An IV line taped into the crook of my left arm feeding a slow, careful drip that left me nauseated and heavy-limbed, but, according to every monitor in the room, safely out of immediate danger. I called Daniel from the recovery room, and I will never forget the sound he made when I told him he had a daughter and a son, both breathing on their own, both already stronger than either of us had dared hope. He was on the next available flight home, still 6 hours out. My parents and arrived at the hospital 19 hours after the twins were born. I want to say I was too relieved to notice the absence of any real urgency in how they walked into my room, but the truth is I noticed immediately and simply didn't want it to be what it was. My mother hugged me briefly and said the babies were beautiful, which they were. My father stood near the window with a folder under his arm that I clocked instantly and tried, for several long minutes, to ignore. Looked at the twins in their bassinets with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between genuine tenderness and something more calculating that I didn't want to name yet. It was my father who finally spoke, pulling a chair close to my bed with the particular deliberateness of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed on the drive over. Maya, I know the timing is terrible and I hate bringing this up right now of all times, but the venue needs the deposit finalized by the end of this week or they're releasing the date to another party. We're still short. Your mother and I have talked and we really do think the cottage is the answer here, just as collateral against a short-term loan, exactly like I explained before. You'd retain ownership. Nothing would change for you. I stared at him, still groggy from the magnesium, my whole body aching in the specific, deep way that follows major surgery. My newborn children in a NICU down the hall that I hadn't even been strong enough to visit yet, and something in me went very still. I told you no 3 weeks ago, Dad. Nothing about that has changed. Maya. My mother's voice carried the particular sharp edge it always got right before she said something she'd clearly already decided was reasonable. Your sister's entire wedding is at risk. This is a family emergency. I just had emergency surgery, I said. I think I understand what a family emergency actually looks like. Finally spoke, arms crossed, her voice tight. You could just help for once instead of making everything about you being the martyr who visited Grandma more. I visited Grandma because I loved her, I said, not to earn a prize. Well, you got the prize anyway, snapped, so maybe act like it. Do you hear yourself? I asked her. I am 2 days out from emergency surgery. My children are down the hall in incubators. And you're standing in my recovery room angry that I won't hand over the one thing Grandma left me. Nobody's angry, my mother said quickly, in the placating tone she used whenever a conversation threatened to become the kind she couldn't control. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone, Maya. Can we please stay focused on that instead of turning this into a referendum on the last 30 years? I am focused, I said. I'm focused on the fact that 4 days ago I called you from my kitchen floor thinking I might be having a stroke and you chose a cake tasting. That is not fair and you know it isn't, my mother snapped, color rising in her face. I told you to call an ambulance. I gave you good advice. You gave me permission to handle it alone, I said. There's a difference. My father stood, moving closer to the bed, the folder still tucked under his arm like a weapon he hadn't drawn yet. This conversation is over being about feelings, Maya. I need a decision. The venue calls tomorrow morning. The answer is no, I said as clearly as my exhausted voice would allow. It was no before I had surgery and it's still no now. I need you all to leave. I need to rest and I need to go see my children. You are being unbelievably selfish, my father said, his voice rising for the first time, after everything this family has given you. What exactly have you given me? I asked, and I felt something in my chest crack open that had been holding itself very carefully closed for years. A cold shoulder every time I made a choice you didn't approve of. A mother who chose a cake tasting over an ambulance. I nearly had a seizure alone in my kitchen 4 days ago and none of you came. That's not fair, my mother started, but my father cut her off, stepping close enough now that his shadow fell directly across my hospital blanket. Enough, he said. You're going to sign this today, Maya, and you're going to stop punishing this entire family because you resent your sister. I reached toward the call button clipped to my bed rail, the reflex of someone who had spent a career recognizing exactly when a situation had crossed a line, and my father, seeing the motion, reacted before I could press it. His hand closed around my left forearm, the arm with the IV line still taped in place, still tender from the insertion, still delivering the last hour of my magnesium treatment, and he squeezed hard, trying to pull my hand away from the call button. The pain that shot up my arm was immediate and blinding, the IV line tearing partially loose from the vein, a thin line of blood beating at the sight of the tape. I cried out before I could stop myself, and somewhere behind the roaring in my ears I heard the heart monitor beside my bed erupt into a rapid, uneven alarm. Dad, let go, you're hurting me. Then stop fighting me, he said, and for one terrible second his grip only tightened, my mother standing frozen by the window, saying nothing, doing nothing, and face gone pale and wide-eyed but similarly, damningly silent. The door opened. A nurse, I would learn her name was, and I would remember it for the rest of my life, took one look at my father's hand still closed around my bruised, bleeding arm, at the alarm still sounding, at my face contorted in pain, and moved with the fast, practiced authority of someone who had seen exactly this kind of situation before and knew precisely how seriously to take it. Sir, step away from the patient right now. My father let go. He took a half step back, already I could see, beginning to construct the version of events he intended to offer, the folder slipping slightly in his grip. My mother finally moved, but only to reach for my father's sleeve, not to check on me. The nurse checked my arm, documented the fresh bruising and the partially dislodged IV site with quick, careful photographs on the hospital's tablet, and asked me directly and in front of all three of them what had happened. I told her, plainly, without softening a single detail. She called hospital security before she'd even finished writing her notes. For the 3 minutes after my family was asked to wait outside, alone in that room with the monitor finally settling back into its steady rhythm, I lay very still and felt the fear underneath everything finally curdle into something colder and much more useful. I thought about my grandmother's voice on her porch years ago, the surf rolling in behind her. Keep records. People forget kindness but never paperwork. I hadn't understood at the time how literally I would need to take that advice. I reached for my phone on the tray table with my good hand. 3 weeks earlier, after that first coffee shop conversation about collateral, Some instinct I hadn't fully examined had made me start keeping things, not out of paranoia exactly, but out of the particular caution my grandmother had spent years quietly teaching me. My phone's voicemail app still held the message my mother had left 2 days after my father's initial ask. A message I'd saved without entirely knowing why, in which she'd said breezily, "Maya, honestly, I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this. It's not like the cottage means anything to you the way it would to the wedding." A message that played back now made her earlier claims about family emergency and helping each other sound very different in context. I also had the voicemail I'd never deleted from that Thursday night. My own frantic message to my mother, timestamped and saved automatically by my phone's cloud backup, followed immediately by her voicemail response the next morning, apologizing lightly for missing the call because she'd been in the middle of something. A response recorded a full 12 hours after I'd been rushed into emergency surgery, a detail that made the timeline of her indifference impossible to argue away. I pressed the call button again, and when returned, I asked her calmly to make sure hospital security preserved the footage from the room's ceiling camera, the standard patient safety camera every post-surgical room carries. She told me it recorded video without sound, silent but sufficient, and that she'd already flagged the incident report to trigger a preservation request before it could be automatically. Between the silent footage that would show my father's hand closing around my arm, the fresh bruising and dislodged IV documented in real time by hospital staff, and the voicemails on my own phone establishing exactly how my mother had responded to a genuine medical emergency 4 days earlier, I had, without ever intending to build a case, built one anyway. I called Daniel from the hospital bed, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and I told him everything. He was still an hour from landing. I could hear, even through the distance and the airport noise behind him, a fury in his voice that was entirely unlike his usual quiet steadiness. "I'm calling the hospital's patient advocate the second I land," he said. "And Maya, I'm proud of you for calling security, for not backing down." Security arrived within minutes and asked me to walk them through what had happened. I did plainly, the same way I'd told. An officer from the Portland Police Bureau was called given the nature of the allegation, assault occurring within a hospital, against a patient, and by the time he arrived to take my statement, I had already pulled up both voicemails and asked the nurse to formally document the preserved camera footage request in writing. My father tried from the hallway to characterize the whole incident as a misunderstanding, a family disagreement that had gotten physical only because emotions were running high on all sides. The responding officer listened to that account and then looked at the fresh bruising on my arm, still visible above the reattached IV line, and asked, evenly, whether a misunderstanding typically left marks. My father was formally arrested that evening on charges of assault. My mother, once the voicemails were reviewed as part of the investigation, and it became clear she'd been present in the room and had done nothing to intervene, was later charged as well, for obstruction, once investigators determined she'd attempted, in a phone call intercepted by hospital staff before I even knew about it, to convince to leave the incident report vague. Was not charged with anything, she'd been present, silent, but hadn't participated directly, though what she'd witnessed, and what she'd chosen to do about it afterward would end up costing her something she hadn't expected to lose. The wedding venue's deposit deadline came and went that Friday unmet. Within a week, the family, by the criminal charges attached to their son's future in-laws, quietly their portion of the funding altogether. According to what I later heard through a cousin who still spoke to me, sat down soon after and asked her point blank whether she genuinely watched our father assault me in a hospital bed and said nothing. She apparently tried to explain that she'd been frozen, that she hadn't known what to do, that it had all happened so fast. Broke off the engagement 3 weeks later. He told her, according to that same cousin, that the problem wasn't that she'd frozen in the moment. It was that in every conversation since, she still hadn't managed to say a single word that sounded like real remorse. The financial unraveling that followed my father's arrest moved with a slow, grinding inevitability that felt entirely unlike the dramatic reckoning I might once have imagined. The collection's primary lender, reviewing the company standing after the assault charges, became local news. A small item in the regional paper, local hotelier charged with assault, accompanied by exactly the kind of reputational damage that travel industry businesses cannot easily absorb, declined to renew a critical line of credit the company had relied on for years. 2 of the 5 properties were sold within 8 months simply to keep the remaining 3 solvent. A regional hospitality trade publication ran a short follow-up piece on the sales, noting only that ownership restructuring was, though anyone who knew the family understood exactly what that phrase was covering for. My father, out on bail awaiting trial, ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended sentence, mandatory anger management, and a restitution order covering my medical expenses that insurance hadn't absorbed, along with the cost of physical therapy for the arm he'd injured. My mother received probation and a permanent record for obstruction, along with a court-mandated no-contact provision that covered both me and the twins for a period of 3 years, separate from and in addition to the protective order I filed on my own. Neither of them ever fully rebuilt the business, or, as far as I know, ever fully rebuilt whatever they'd once told themselves they were protecting by treating me the way they had. I filed for and received a permanent protective order covering myself and both of my children. I spent the following months doing the quiet, unglamorous work of healing physical therapy for the residual soreness in my arm, longer than it should have taken to admit to myself how much of that soreness had never really been about the muscle. Daniel came home from his assignment and never left again, except for the fire seasons that were simply part of the shape of our life, and every evening for the first few months, without either of us saying much about it. He'd sit beside me while I fed the twins and quietly check the fading bruise on my arm, the way you check on a wound you're finally allowed to stop worrying about. I went back to the cottage in Cannon Beach the following spring, almost exactly a year after my grandmother had died in that same season, on a morning when the coastal fog was just beginning to lift off the headland the way it always did. I brought the twins with me for the first time, 5 months old by then, strapped into their car seats for the whole drive, sleeping through most of it the way babies mercifully do. I spent that first week doing small repairs by hand, the way my grandmother had taught me, sanding down a section of the porch railing that had gone rough with salt weather, resealing the old window frames against the coming winter. On the last afternoon, I found the small brass plaque she'd had made decades earlier, worn nearly smooth by weather, Eleanor's rest engraved into it in simple lettering, taken down years before during a repainting project and never quite rehung. I cleaned it and I hung it myself above the front door, my arm strong again by then, steady on the ladder in a way that felt, that particular afternoon, like its own quiet kind of proof. I stood back and looked at it for a long time before I went inside to check on the twins. I used to believe my family's love for me existed, just quieter, less demonstrative, something I simply hadn't learned yet how to hear. I understand now that quiet and absent can look identical from the inside for years, and that the only real way to tell them apart is what happens when you actually need someone to show up. My parents didn't love me quietly. They simply didn't come, and called it something gentler for as long as I let them. I stand on that porch most mornings now, before the twins are awake, watching the mist come off water my grandmother chose because she said it caught the first light better than anywhere else on the coast. It still does. Sleeps in the room that used to be my grandmother's, in a crib set exactly where the old reading chair used to sit, and William beside her. And some mornings, watching them breathe in that particular unguarded way only very small children manage, I understand finally what my grandmother meant, all those years ago on the same porch, about keeping records. Not because I don't trust the people I love, because I finally know, in a way I wish I hadn't needed to learn, exactly what it costs when you don't. Daniel still checks the fading line on my arm sometimes, without meaning to, the way you touch a doorframe you once walked into in the dark, more habit than worry now. I don't mind it. I've stopped needing the scar to mean nothing. It means instead that I finally learned the difference between the people who show up because they love you and the people who only ever wanted something you had, and that difference, once you can actually see it clearly, is not a thing you ever unsee again. Some evenings, feeding the twins on that same porch as the light goes gold and then gray over the water, I think about the version of myself who sat in that coffee shop believing a folder of numbers could ever be a fair trade for the one place in the world that had never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I already was. She wasn't wrong to say no. She just didn't yet know how far they'd go to make her regret it. I'm glad now that she never found out how far they'd go until it was already over, and she was already free.